Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to take part in this debate, and what we may lack in numbers has been more than made up in the quality of all of the speeches that we have heard thus far. Maybe it is a sign that we have taken what was achieved 25 years ago for granted. But I agree with at least two speakers who have said we should never, ever, ever do that. Now, it is an occasion to say thank you, and many people have been thanked. There's one person who hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is Margaret Thatcher and Gareth Fitzgerald, because the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement was hugely significant in the series of events that led up to what happened 25 years ago, because it embraced the legacy of the history that has bound Ireland and Britain together. It put to rest the idea that what was happening in Northern Ireland was a trouble in just a part of the United Kingdom that had no relationship to what had gone on over 800 years from the original Norman invasion, the claim of the English kings to the land of Ireland, and the way in which the Irish people were denied their land, their voice, their language, their culture, their voice, their political representation during the course of those 800 bloody years. John Major, of course, who helped to also lay the foundation, and Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, Mo Mowlam have been mentioned already. We should add John Mitchell and Jonathan Powell. I mean, Jonathan Powell spent probably more time than anyone else on the shuttle from London to Belfast, back and forth, to help lay the groundwork. And as the Secretary of State said, countless other people, many others, some of whom have been mentioned, who contributed to this unique moment. Now, I grew up in London, and I watched the reporting of the Troubles on the television, and I read about it in the newspapers, and I'll be frank, like many people, I despaired at what I was seeing. And if you lived in London during the 70s and 80s, and you got on the Underground, you would come in and you would just look round the carriage to try and see if there were any bags that didn't appear to belong to anyone who was travelling. I will never forget, as long as I live, the only time I've heard a bomb go off. I was in bed, and it was this sound. You might think it's a bang, but as I heard it, it was a kind of deep thump. But it appeared to be so close that I got out of bed, got dressed, and went down to Kensington High Street, which is where I was living at the time, and I thought it must be there. Turned out it was 2.5 miles away, but it had travelled through the night air. Now, if someone had said to me at that precise moment, I know you may be despairing, Hilary, and look at all of this violence, but at some point in the future, the man who, in opposition to the agreement that Margaret Thatcher signed, famously stood up and said, I say never, 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 never. And a former leader of the Provisional IRA would sit side by side with each other. As the first minister and the deputy first minister of a power-sharing government, I would probably have said to that person, I would love to live to see that, but I don't suppose I will. But I did. We did. And that tells us how extraordinary that moment was. And what was achieved in the run-up to the event that we are celebrating was astonishing. It was inspirational. It was full of hope. And I hope there's nobody in the country who hasn't watched the last episode of Derry Girls. I think the chair of the Select Committee referred to that in a previous speech. I watched that episode. Anyone who did was profoundly moved. I wept, I'll be frank. Because because it conveyed the sense of hope that that process had brought to pass. And for those of you who haven't watched it, set against the background of the run-up to the referendum that took place in May in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. And it just crystallised that sense of hope that the agreement gave to the people of both of those places. And I would say that having taken that step, those entrusted with the political responsibility in Northern Ireland have a duty, and I use that word advisedly, have a duty to make the institutions work. And we have seen how one side and then the other have walked away because they are capable of doing so and collapsing them. But, and I understand the reasons perhaps more so in the latter case than I did in the former, in what began as a row over, I think, the renewable heat incentive in Northern Ireland, but was actually about other things, Irish Language Act and so on, the honouring of agreements that have been entered into. But there is a great responsibility of the legacy to make those institutions work, because the agreement has given something so precious to the people of Northern Ireland, which is peace, not absolute, but peace that is so much better than what had happened before. And I think when we seek elected office, since the Honourable Member for Strangford made reference, I was sitting there calculating. I served 20 years as a councillor and nearly 24 years here in this House, so I'm heading for 44 years as an elected representative. But we get elected, and I think the public expects us to turn up and do our job. Yeah. But why do we work so hard to get elected if we're not going to turn up and do our job? And there's also responsibility on others not to do anything that will undermine what has been achieved 25 years ago. And that is why the Windsor Framework was so important. So important, because the parties to the negotiations finally realised, as well as how we deal with the relations between Britain and the EU going forward, there's something very, very special at stake. And the last point I want to make is about the lessons. And my honourable friend who speaks from the front bench, in his terrific contribution, also reflected on some of those lessons. I think the first one is peace is built step by step. Because in thanking a whole load of people, one is going back in history over a long period of time. And there's so many stages one could mention. But the sheer brilliance of the decommissioning process. Because when you think about it, the Provisional IRA was not under any circumstances going to hand over its weapons to the British Army it had been fighting. So great minds thought, well, how the hell are we going to deal with this? Someone came up with a brilliant idea. What if we get someone independent, trusted, General de Chastelain, who has been referred to and should also be thanked, and he'll go to the places where the weapons have been put beyond use, and he will come back and tell all of us, yes, I've seen them, they're there, they are not capable of being used anymore. And it was true for the Provisionals weapons and also the Loyalists. Because, of course, when you're trying to build confidence step by step, the side that has experienced the violence of the other says, well, they say they've given up, but how do I know? And there's a deep well of distrust and anger and pain and bitterness because of all the lives that have been lost as a result of violence on all sides. And yet that is how that part of the process was achieved. I think the second lesson is persistence. All of those who did their bit over the years did not give up. And can I say to the chair of the Select Committee, when he reflected on what I think Tony Blair had said about if Twitter had existed, Twitter is not the real world, although we sometimes think it is. Because when we are looking for feedback on what we have been saying, and if we go onto Twitter, well, there's plenty of people who will give us their opinion, but it is not the real world. And holding to a belief you have and your determination to achieve it is very important. The third is courage, which has been touched on. You know, in conflicts, and when you feel that a wrong has been done, it's actually much easier to sit there and say, I am the victim, and you are my oppressor. And then you go around to the other side of the mythical table, And the person there says, no, 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 I am the victim and you are the oppressor. And when one reflects on the degree of courage that was required on the unionist side, David Trimble and others, to say to the unionist community, you know what, they're nearly half the population. We are going to have to share power with them. And the courage on the provisional IRA side, Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, to say, you know what, lads, we cannot bomb Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom. Now, those were two very courageous things to have said and steps to have taken at great personal risk, but without them, it would not have happened. And the other lesson of that is nobody can want peace more than the parties to the conflict themselves. Nobody. The outside involvement, the efforts of the Americans and others, hugely important. But in the end, the parties to the conflict have to recognise the game is up. We now need to have to compromise in the interests of peace. And, of course, leadership, because it is leadership that enables courage to turn into achievement. And, you know, one of the legacies of the Good Friday Agreement, there's a wonderful organisation called Forward Thinking. Some members in the House may know them. They work in the Middle East to try and build discussion and relationships between the parties to the conflict there. And do you know what is one of the things that they do? They bring people to Northern Ireland and the Republic and they say, sit down and listen to what people who were, in effect, fighting each other 25 years and more ago can tell you about how they transformed the lives of the people in their community by showing persistence, courage and political leadership. And the final thing I want to say is it is in many ways easy to say no. It is sometimes really, really difficult to say yes. And yet, when we do so, just look at what can be achieved. And that, I think, for all of us, is the true legacy of that miraculous Good Friday 25 years ago.
Stephen Farry.